So you've written the answer to all of the various questions on the cultural bias PowerPoint, and now you want to mark them, identify your strengths, identify your weaknesses, and then bring them to your tutor to mark and discuss as well. So please don't, I would encourage you not to use this unless you're really, really stuck prior to you writing the exam answers, or if you really have to, look through it, turn it off, forget about it for a little bit, come back and write your answers. It's very, very easy to write them with lots of guidance. Unfortunately, you won't have that in the exam. Okay. So, if I can get onto the first slide. Oh, gone too far now. They're the three possible exam questions. There weren't any true specimen papers, or pass marks. Past exam questions, so I've had to make them up and create a mark scheme. However, I've related them very closely to other questions from similar topics to give me an idea, so I'm fairly confident they're very roughly the right kind of questions to ask, and they build your knowledge up. So the first one's just asking about problems with ethnocentrism, the second one's asking for examples, and then the problems with ethnocentrism, and the third one is asking you to discuss cultural bias. As always, if you see a discuss question, and if you see a discuss question and it's 16 marks, you know that it's describe and evaluate. So briefly outline one problem associated with ethnocentric research. You get 1 mark just for defining ethnocentrism, because within the definition itself you're clearly evidencing some kind of some issue, and then you want to go on to extend and explore that problem a little bit further. So hopefully what you did is you spoke about ethnocentrism as holding one culture's behaviour is superior to another, so other cultures, or using one culture as a bias or as a way of judging other cultures, as a way of judging the culture. So this is normal, this is abnormal, and there's really good definitions in the Cat book and the Green Haired Girl book, which are far better than the ones on the PowerPoint slide. Then you would want to go on to explain why that's a problem. So you discuss about it holding as one superior culture, one culture's behaviour superior to the other. And then the next thing you would do is you talk about how one of the issues is that it kind of normalises one culture in particular and leads to suggesting that another culture's behaviour is abnormal. Of course, the problem with that is then that research can't be generalised effectively, or it has key impacts on the validity of research that is conducted. So return it back to evaluation, to research methods you all know the problems with having any kind of bias in there, or it not being able to effectively explain all cultures, you can't generalise it, etc, etc. You've got loads to say. This one, identify one piece of research and discuss the issues. So AO1 is 2 marks and AO3 is 2 marks. So 2 marks for identifying and describing a piece of ethnocentric research briefly and with a focus on ethnocentrism. So you wouldn't get any marks for talking about first what they did in the strange situations, the mother was sat in the room with the child, etc, etc. It needs to be much more focused than that. And then 2 marks for evaluating this research, once again in terms of ethnocentrism. So you don't want to say, for example, the strange situation was based on a lab study, so lacked ecological validity, because that would be a really basic one for the second year, but also it's not linked to ethnocentrism. Below are a list of a couple of examples. So the explains the strange situation, Milgram, Yerkes IQ test, which is the one we talked about that focused on finding that non-Western cultures generally were less intelligent, but that's because of flaws in the research methods itself. And then Mead as well with the anthropological research for Papua New Guinea. But you can use any research that you can think of, refer back to your tables that you created in ETHNOCENTRIC, and then explain why it is ethnocentric, so what is a problem. So link the concept of ethnocentrism, so the strange situation, try to apply what was a very culturally specific set of types of attachment, 3 types of attachment. They tried to consider them as universal behaviours and apply them to all cultures in their child raising. Why was that a problem? And then so whatever example you give, you go on to explain why it's a problem. Well, it's a problem because it draws conclusions in research that lacks validity, that isn't representative of all kind of cultures, that again holds one culture above the other, so therefore kind of normalises the Western culture and therefore suggests that other cultures are abnormal or wrong when in fact they're just different. And then what impact does this have? So you could talk about 2 ideas here. So you could come from a research methods point of view, but it reduces the validity of the research, means that it can't be as effectively generalised, means that we have unclear understanding of the different behaviours within humans, any of those things. Or you could talk about it from and perhaps not as effective, but definitely one that's worth considering, the idea that it has issues with negative, it perpetuates negative stereotypes. So we still hold the stereotype that German people are very cold and consider that a negative, whereas in fact it's just a different way of raising children. Okay. And then the 16 marker. So the way I would approach this is I'd give an explanation of each of the key terms and then link an example to it. And the reason that I would do that is because it says refer to examples in your answer, so you make it really, really clear. And I'd constantly use for example to make it really clear to the examiner that that's what I was including. So you would define cultural bias and give an example of it, define ethnocentrism, give an example of it, define alpha bias example, beta bias example, always linking it back, always making it really, really clear why that example is illustrating the key term. And I would be very, very careful because I have quite a few key terms to talk about, and it's only 6 marks for the AO1, so keep it focused, okay? And then of course go on to, and if you're not sure about any of these by now, you want to talk about the negative perpetuating negative stereotypes, the flawed research. Indigenous psychologies was something that were developed, so a positive of identifying cultural bias is the response of Indigenous psychologies, which is allowed to explore things in detail, and then also it encourages to develop effective ethic research, so kind of research that considers all cultures and is much more valid. So this is the mark scheme here. It's a really generic one that's used for everything, but it gives you a rough idea. So and you can break them down. Your AO1, your knowledge, needs to be accurate and generally well detailed. So the accuracy is most important, but you do need a level of detail in there as well. It can't just be accurate with no detail whatsoever, but accuracy is vital, and then it has to be pretty detailed as well. Dropping down the marks, knowledge is evident, so you do know a bit, but it's not incredibly detailed and it's not incredibly accurate. Knowledge is present, so it's there, and then knowledge is limited. And I appreciate it's difficult to kind of make the decisions between those, but consider the amount of detail that you've got and the accuracy of it all in there as well, and that should give you a bit of an idea. If you're covering everything, then you're definitely accurate and detailed, and as that starts to slip and there's less information, then you can move down the levels. And then it talks about application here, which isn't relevant. However, discussion and evaluation is thorough and effective, and mostly effective, and then dropping down, partly effective, and poor or limited. And the way that I personally think you drop down those is depending on how effectively you use your explain sentences. So at the top level, we'd see giving a point, giving an example, explaining how that example is, how that illustrates the point that you're making, illustrates some issues, and then linking it all back to gender bias. Probably, if it's mostly effective, a couple of those evaluation points you'd probably do that for, but a couple you might forget to use the explain and the link, or you might not do it so effectively. So don't forget to include lots of detailed terminology. Extend your knowledge as far as you can, and always ask yourself the question, am I making it clear why this is related to cultural bias? Only partly effective or limited. Generally, you've kind of you've vaguely had a go at the piece structure, but it's not brilliant, and you certainly haven't explained anything effectively. Clear, coherent and focused, so that's kind of the level of your communication. So don't forget, in essays you are being assessed on your level of communication as well, and I think if you use your structuring really clearly, then it naturally comes. So proofread things, look back over it. Does it make sense? Is it clear? Is it well structured? Is it focused on cultural bias? Am I constantly referring back to cultural bias? And then the focus is specialist terminology. Use effectively, mostly use effectively, inappropriately, or absent or not at all. So if you don't want to be in the bottom band, straight away start using that terminology and just use it all of the time and consider it. And that all of this intertwines together. I think if you use specialist terminology, then your discussion and your evaluation is far more likely to be thorough and effective. If you use terminology, then it gives more detail and is more accurate because you're able to describe the kind of concepts more clearly and using the right terminology, which makes it more accurate. And that's it. So knowledge. So you want to think about the things you're being assessed on. You're being assessed on your knowledge. You're being assessed on your ability to evaluate, and not necessarily using the P structure, because if you didn't use it and you could still do those things, you'd still get the marks. However, the best way, the easiest way to ensure that it's thorough and effective is to use the point, example, explain, link, and then of course if you want to, however, as well, make sure your structure is clear and your communication is effective, and use specialist terminology. Okay, so knowledge, so have good knowledge, evaluate, make sure it's clear, well structured and focused, and make sure you use specialist terminology throughout. Final one, common mistakes, not writing enough. So you're aiming 450 to 500 words, not keeping a careful ratio, and you can see AO1 to AO3. So about 6 marks, so it's about 150 to 180 words, AO1, 370 to AO3. Not including examples would be a big no-no, considering particularly this question asks for them. Not referring examples back to the key terms, so just having random examples that are isolated without linking. Not using the PL structure, we've discussed why, because it moves you down the bands of effectiveness of evaluation. Not explaining why something is a weakness at all, so not using the explain, or not explaining why something is a weakness effectively. So this is not a year one anymore, detailed and extended use of terminology. So use the PL structure, make sure you explain why something's a weakness, work really hard to make that as effective as possible by using your terminology, extending it, and then link back to the theory or the concept itself. So always talk about cultural bias within this one, of course, or whatever concept it may be. And finally, and most importantly, one of the key common mistakes that people make is they rely too heavily on their notes when writing the essay, and they don't do it in timed conditions. So make sure that you avoid both of those. You could create your essay plan using your notes. You could do lots of things to prepare yourself, because it isn't actually an exam. But my advice would be 20 minutes on the timer, time yourself, write it all down, and you'd go with sort of 7 minutes for AO2 and then the rest for AO3, as a very, very rough idea. So read back your essay question, have a think, did you do it under time conditions, etc., etc., and then give yourself some marks on the mark scheme on the band, and then bring it to me to discuss.